feel comfortable being recorded, please do keep your camera off. You can change your name as well, so you can delete your name on Zoom. And shall we just share the group agreement just to start with as well? This is the group agreement we share for every webinar, so it's quite generic, and you've probably come across them before. So it's a lunchtime webinar, so please do attend in whatever capacity. You might be on your lunch break, so chill out, get your lunch, have a cup of tea, get up and walk around. Unless you have been invited to speak, please just keep yourself on mute. Please do use the chat. It's going to be an hour webinar, so I'm hoping there will be time for questions at the end, and I'll keep an eye on the chat and try and feed some questions in. Hopefully this will be a really kind, collaborative space. We're going to be talking about lived experience in research, and I think I can see a few lived experience researcher names in the sort of crowd, which is nice. So yeah, hopefully it'll be yeah, a really kind, compassionate space. And I think that's all we need to say on the group agreement. I have not introduced myself yet, so I will introduce myself now. I'm Emma Watson. I'm the program lead for research at IMROC, and I'm a lived experience researcher myself. And I'm really excited about this. This is a little mini series. This is the first one. We have a demystifying research series, and within that, we want to help research feel more accessible to a broader audience, and it's often not very accessible. And we also want to champion lived experience in research, because we know that when you include lived experience in research, then different questions are asked, different methods are used, different relationships with participants and ethics, the way that findings are presented are different. So it really enhances research. And so we wanted to create a mini series that showcases what lived experience researchers can do. So this is that series. And I think I'm just going to hand over to Katie and Sabina. So as I said, please do use the chat. Katie and Sabina are going to present, and then there's going to be a little bit of time in breakout rooms, and then some time for some questions and answers as well. So over to you guys.
Amazing, thank you, Emma. Yeah, so I'm Sabina. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a lived experience researcher. I completed a PhD which looked at the links between altered states or madness. I kind of use the words interchangeably just to say, and the ways that society frames it and responds to it, and how these kind of interweave. And this was, yeah, very much driven by my lived experience, kind of in the middle of madness and religion and spirituality from a young age. And then as I grew up, started to have my own experiences of altered states. And so this very much took me to doing the research that I did, although to start with, I wasn't kind of explicitly like out as someone with lived experience in academic space, because it didn't feel safe to be. But then as I progressed with the research, I did kind of come out in this way. So that was, yeah, a bit of a maybe less usual pathway. So yeah, in terms of how my experience influenced my research design, I think it wasn't explicitly sort of set up like that, but definitely 100% all the choices I made, the methodology I used, the way that I approached and spoke to people, and what kinds of frameworks I brought in were 100% shaped by my own experience and the ways that I was thinking about this because of that. So yeah, just to kind of express some like nuance in that. Okay, I'll leave it there and pass to Katie.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sabina. Morning, everyone. Or kind of lunchtime. Happy lunchtime, everyone. It's great to see so many people here. So I'm Katie. I'd already been working in the mental health field for over 25 years, when I went back into academia to do my MSc. I think it was 2021. Since my own crisis, which happened in my 30s, which did involve an altered state experience, which we will describe very briefly for those of you who may not be familiar with that term. I've identified as someone with lived experience, but and I completely dismissed a psychiatric framing of it. I saw an alternative understanding because of my experience in the mental health field and sort of the experiences that I'd seen people go through and the harm that had been caused. I chose not to accept that framing from my experience. So it was interesting when I went back into the academic arena that I kind of felt like it was necessary, as Sabina was saying, to like hide that aspect of myself again. In a way, I could feel the shame kind of resurfacing about my lived experience. But this really drove my focus of my research. So I chose to research into whether there is meaning in experiences that get called madness, because of my lived experience and that of my family member. And on reflection, I think that the enforced sort of repression that I was feeling in the academic field kind of also came through as this fierce advocacy for my research participants, all of whom had been labelled with psychosis. I chose to use heuristic inquiry as my methodology because it really honoured participants as equal members in the process. They're called co-researchers because of the wisdom that they bring. And I really wanted to honour that. The biggest challenges I found conducting my research was firstly the strength of my own positionality. I was so passionate, so I had to really hold that in awareness, which is another reason I chose heuristic inquiry, because it's a very strict reflective process. I don't think any research is unbiased, to be honest, but I was kind of wanting to be aware of that. And ironically, how unethical the ethical process felt to me, because it wasn't trauma informed either for myself or my research participants. And that felt really alien to me, coming from this arena where I'd been really sort of focusing on a trauma responsive approach. And so I really wondered who the ethical process was there to serve. The participants or the institution, but I won't say more than that. I'll leave you to sort of think about that for yourselves. So as a quick introduction to this session, Sabina and I are going to talk briefly about themes and insights that came from our own experience, from our own research into these altered state experiences. We'll start looking at what we mean by moving away from the dominant paradigm, decentralization, and the importance of peer support in those meaning-making processes. And we'll finally look at some specific symbology that came through. So to start with, I'm just going to screen share again. Please shout if you can't see the slides. So just to start, we thought it would make sense to start with what we actually mean by the term altered states of consciousness. And this was a term coined by an American psychologist and parapsychologist known for his work on the nature of consciousness, Charles Tart, in 1972. And he was one of the founders in the field of transpersonal psychology. And he considers transient states as subjective experiential phenomena, example, as they occur in sleep, dreams, meditation, hypnosis, and as caused by ingesting psychedelics. In Western psychiatry, as we all know, these kinds of experiences have been codified in the DSM as pathological manifestations of self-loss, such as dissociative disorders like psychosis or schizophrenia. And they're considered to be altered in the sense that they are beyond the realm of what is considered in the West, in the kind of global North, as ordinary states of consciousness. So I will hand over to Sabina to talk about decentralization.
Thank you. Yeah, so this term altered states also refers, to a move to more neutral language about these experiences. So it's language that's focused on describing the experience, rather than defining it immediately as, say, a symptom, which can be loaded with assumptions and associations. So we're like stripping things back, uh, rather than suggesting another set way to see them. We're kind of stripping back the language. So grounded in this is the perspective that the way that we frame these experiences can be context dependent. So, for example, that pathology is not the only way to understand and respond. There may be other alternatives. So, here in the Anglo-Western world, the dominant paradigm for framing these experiences and for responding to them is through psychiatry, which medicalizes them. They're seen as symptoms of an overarching disorder. We go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And so, this term decentralization refers to a change to a different structure. So moving away from like one central dominant paradigm to the possibility of different ones that can form through contexts that are local and specific to a person or a community. So this marks a shift in perspective, where explanations and responses to these experiences are not the only way, they are a way. So this perspective that there's no singular overarching truth. And just to note, we're not saying that the medicalizing framework is never a good framework. We're saying that it's not the only framework. It can be one of many. So Christy Dotson has written about this powerful difference between setting up a framework as a framework compared to being the only framework, which affirms a kind of dominance and hierarchy, which can block possible alternatives. And so I like to think of this as like choice, not truth. So promoting choice for how a person can relate to their experiences. And then, perhaps explanation itself is Western centric. Do altered states always need to be explained and defined as something? And we'll speak a bit later about going beyond language. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Lena. So one example of such a decentralized framework, or what Lisa Fannin in her book Warp and Weft calls scripts for experience, which I really like, is spiritual emergency. And this came up as a research theme in my research. All of my co-researchers used the word awakening. So the International Spiritual Emergence Network explains spiritual emergence as a challenging natural process of human growth and transformation characterized by increased awareness, greater sensitivities, richer connection to others and our surrounding world. And they can seem unusual and challenging to the experience or those around them, as they can seem outside of everyday consensus reality in the Western sense. It's common to become more concerned with socioeconomic, health, ecological, sort of existential, big life questions, and what is our meaning and purpose during these experiences. And like my co-researchers, this framing was a helpful step for me in making sense of my experience. But in the same way as attributing any kind of label, like Sabina said, it can then become restrictive, or even polarizing if we over-identify with it. and kind of keep ourselves within that community, it can ostracize others, lead to dismissing other people's points of view, or even possibilities for the trajectory of our own journey. So my research demonstrated that aligning with this particular framework, however, was an empowering way for the co-researchers in their recovery journey to connect with like-minded others. So we've got that sort of, it can be helpful, but also if we over-identify, it can be restrictive. So in terms of identifying as having an awakening, Layla described that in terms of waking up to the fact that we as humans are more than just physical beings. So I'm not going to spend long talking about this because we've got such little time, but we'll share the slides with you so you can have a look at them in more detail afterwards. But just to touch on a few points about why peer support was so important in shared meaning making. This organically came up through the data in my research. When I was doing the interviews, I actually added this question to the interview protocol: what ideally did you need during your experience? Because all of my co-researchers were talking about the fact that they'd found it essential to make sense of their experiences and feel less isolated through finding peer support. And some of the sub themes for that were they had this real kind of desire for someone who just got it from a lived experience perspective, that feeling of being heard without judgment. I remember somebody saying they just didn't want anybody else's worldview being pushed on them, that kind of non-hierarchical reciprocal intervention, and this real longing to be in community with others to make sense of the experience. This arc of meaning making came through as really evident through everyone's journey. So co-researchers started off feeling quite isolated and fearful of their experiences. Like Tam said, she was just longing for someone to be interested in her own interpretation of her experience. And then with the first peer contact, as Alan says, knowing you're not alone and having validation is such an important stepping stone towards any kind of positive transformation. Eventually, through the process of non-hierarchical sharing, this led my co-researchers to kind of an identity reconstruction and also a purpose emerging, because all of them, as Jordana says here, had sort of found that they'd ended up supporting other people as a result of their own experiences, so providing mutual transformation, which led to a sense of community belonging. And as Ruth said, she found her tribe, that safe space is what helped her to sort of find her authentic self as well. So I'll hand back to Sabina to talk about what is happening in these spaces.
Thank you. So yeah, Katie's findings about non-hierarchical relational safety and the mutuality and the sharing to kind of combat isolation that was found through peer support also connects to some of my research findings. So I was looking at the affect, the feeling of different responses to altered states on a quite a like primary pre-conscious level. So I was looking at how altered states feel, but also how it feels to be in certain contexts that are navigating or responding to them. So I looked at some different settings. I looked at the hospital setting. I looked at diagnostic narratives, and I also looked at peer support groups. So I was using a method called phenomenology, which is a particular method, which means looking on a very kind of raw experiential level. So what does it feel like to move through the world in this particular space, or with this particular label, for example, was some of what I was looking at. And my research was grounded in ideas about shared experience, that we all are plugged into this shared world together, and we all kind of co-regulate this sense of reality in the shared world, also called the consensus world. So I was looking at the implicit trust that the shared world is real, which is referred to as habitual trust in some of the literature. This is a very implicit trust that others are sharing in the same reality as us. So, for example, that we're all having this conversation now. There is a feeling of realness. But then I also looked at experiences that also have a feeling of realness, but are not part of the shared world. So like these altered state experiences that we're speaking about, people can have experiences that kind of move away from the consensus world and touch on other kinds of realities and worlds. And so rather than othering these experiences as not real, simply not real or delusional, I looked at how we can create ways to kind of walk between worlds, to create bridges, still retaining enough trust in the shared world, but also not push away these other kinds of worlds and experiences that are not shared by others. So I started exploring this idea of making the consensus world more accessible for these other kinds of experiences. And so one of the spaces I looked at was the peer support group space. And this was really interesting in terms of what is happening in this shared space. And something is going on an embodied level in the here and now as interactions and dialogue unfolds between people that marks a kind of trust in the moment of the space. A trust that is implicitly in the background of the interactions and grows as they unfold. So not necessarily a trust with any one particular person, but a sense of being plugged into something relational with others. This kind of seemed to be like the magic of the group space. And important for this is was the lack of hierarchy in the group. The fact that no one can tell anyone that their experience is or is not valid or how to respond to it. So there's openness and possibility for different approaches and expressions to emerge. So the trust found in these spaces enables new processes to emerge that are not based on hierarchy and risk. So I found in some of the other settings that hierarchy and risk seems to unravel this habitual trust, this implicit trust, and could actually push people further away from the consensus world by creating a harsher, more polarizing binary where you either comply by minimizing or correcting your altered states, or you end up fighting against that and perhaps relying more on the altered state experience, but then losing trust in the shared world as a result. So this is where the idea of bridging comes in. So there's an importance in having alternatives that can exist in these shared spaces that bring people together to co-create possibilities of new kinds of consensus worlds that exist through these alternative ways of relating to madness. So these spaces can build bridges through this openness and possibility. And in seeing the space as this embodied relational space unfolding, there was something about moving away from a need for cognitive explanation, but towards the importance of process and context, which also suggests something about going beyond language. something about feeling and relationship and process, and trusting mystery. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sabina. And it's so interesting, it's so fascinating. We didn't know anything about each other's research, but there's so many overlaps. So I'm going to share some themes that came up as a result of my own co-researchers kind of leaning into this, trusting in the mystery and the unfolding process of their own experiences. And I've linked them to existing theory, transpersonal theory, because we've got that kind of double bind inherent in this of like needing validation for our experiences, needing it to be often sort of grounded in empirical research so that we are taken seriously. But then there's the other side, the flip side of that, of knowing that can be restrictive and knowing that these experiences are beyond language and they're beyond like this conceptual framework, as Sabina has been saying. So in terms of themes, I'm going to kind of race through these a bit because I know we've not got much time and we want to leave some time for discussion. But symbolic injury came up very much and as Sabina was saying, these experiences were beyond language. And so when language wasn't possible, it wasn't possible to kind of make sense of these experiences, symbolic imagery emerged. And many of you will have heard maybe of Jungian archetypes, which are like basic templates for human experience that we all share and that can emerge when unconscious material surfaces. So Donald Kalshed built on Jung's theories in terms of these symbolic images or archetypes offering us protection during really traumatic young experiences. So in his view, this mythopoetic world is like an inner landscape of symbols, archetypal figures, and imaginal experiences that emerge when the psyche is overwhelmed. And so in this sense, these experiences of symbology, like snakes or demons or anything like that, they're often kind of polarized as well, like light and dark, devils and angels. They don't depict meaningless hallucinations in the sense they're kind of part of a very wise protective healing mechanism. So Tam said that she'd sort of retrospectively come to understand her experience in terms of archetypes, and she said it felt like her experience was like a tower in the tarot. She knew that it was a huge destruction that was happening in order that something could be built anew. Something that you may yourself, or if you work in mental health system, be familiar with is it's really common for people to say they feel like they're dying when they're in the midst of these altered state processes. And this theme of death and dying came up a lot in my research. And ego dissolution is a really recognized mechanism within transpersonal theoretical world as this developmental process. And John Weir Perry talks about this as a renewal process. So metaphors of death and rebirth allowed my co-researchers to reframe their experiences not as a static pathology, but as part of a difficult transformation process. So Jay said that it felt like his old self was being kind of killed off. It was stripping away what was not in alignment with his authentic core. Non-verbal codes came up because some of my co-researchers said they couldn't speak and during the height of their experience. Layla described herself as being mute when she was hospitalized. And so, yeah, these times, these non-verbal codes was a way of communicating beyond language that came to the fore. And there are theories about this kind of non-verbal imagery reflecting pre-verbal trauma memories. So there's a couple of references here for that. So the idea is that yeah, these symbols kind of convey meaning which may not be understood on a consensus level, but actually during integration can make a lot of sense. And Ruth and Jay both shared their artwork, which they'd automatically drawn during their extreme states. And this is an image from Ruth's hospital journal. Jay referred to his doodles and drawings as his motifs, and Ruth said that they were her code. She said that in the sketchbook she had lots of symbols and signs that were just, and she said that's just my code. There were loads of spirals and black and white paths to nowhere. And actually, there are theories around kind of spiral dynamics and the fact that when we evolve as humans and transform, it's a spiral process, it's not a linear process. So actually, that makes sense on that level as well. So participants during their experiences entered what is kind of said to be this mythic liminal space of two worlds that supported their integration of their experiences. Some theorists suggest that the psyche resides in this place, sort of between body and mind, in this collective field where the mystery is, and that we can tap into information from this field when we're in these altered states. And then actually that can be helpful if it's framed that way. And I think this quote from Tam is so poignant in this respect. She says there are so many of us that are bridges between these worlds, and there's so much that we could learn, but we're turning our back on this incredible treasure trove of meaning and awareness. So in these experiences, language or even like conceptual frameworks, maps don't explain the territory. They're not enough because they are sort of ineffable. And I think this quote from Alan kind of sums it up perfectly. He said, I got a diagnosis of psychosis, but I can kind of shrug it off. You know, it's just semantics, because all psychosis really means is non-consensus reality. So I'm back to you, Sabina.
Thank you. Yeah, so what Katie was describing about going beyond language and into these mythic realms of symbols really also relates to what was coming up for me towards the end of my PhD, as I started in my own experience to think more and more about symbol. And I started to think of symbol as a methodology. So I'll speak a bit more about what I mean by this. Symbol can be a method of communication and also relating to past and future, and of regulating and processing the world. Yeah, when words fall short. And symbols are everywhere. They exist, but also respond to our use of them as their meanings can unfold over time with collective processes and culture. New layers and associations are added to them. They grow and shift with collective processes. So in this way, they are non-exhaustive and non-linear. They have a kind of infinite quality, and that their meanings can keep unfolding, but also a very direct quality, being visual and almost subconscious in some instances. And they're also interactive and relational, so they merge and unfold and spiral through our use of them. And so this shares some qualities with mad experience, the directness, the infinite quality, but also the non-linearity and the responsiveness to how we interact with it. And this is what I was thinking about as I was studying these interconnections through my own lived experience as well as that of others. And so having a relationship myself with mythology and tarot as well, and art, and this relationship to symbol through those contexts ended up providing a kind of scaffolding for my own relationship to altered state experiences, in which it allowed me to, cultivate this symbolic language as something that is alive and changing and growing all the time, embedded in an outlook on the world where everything is connected and in dialogue with everything else. And I speak about this in my recent paper, Resisting Fear of Madness, which is linked at the end on the last slide. So yeah, like the content of altered state experiences such as visions or presences, I started to think about them as existing in similar ways to symbols, not necessarily as metaphors that can be reduced down to something else, but as parts of the collective imagination, this space that kind of exists outside of the usual senses that we're trained to use, but which is also responsive to our interacting with it. So symbol allows for meaning making in a way that does not rely on cognitive explanation. So meaning can be a non-linguistic and creative process that can move through mad experience. 11Q. So once taking seriously the significance of symbol in my own experience and also for some of the people that I was speaking to, I decided to experiment with the form of the thesis and use symbol to better comprehend and demonstrate it. This was very much right at the end, so it didn't end up in the submitted version, but I would like to develop this and take it forward somehow, perhaps in a co-produced way. And this came out of a frustration with the limitations of the linear format of thesis writing, which didn't seem to fit what I was trying to express, and felt contradictory to how I understood madness, as well as how madness weaves into society and is affected by our relationship to it. So this the spiraling structure of the argument and the work that I was creating seemed to fit a symbolic form, with kind of many threads and a very non-linear format, because the thesis is mapping the interconnections between altered states and the social context through which they are framed and navigated and responded to by society. So these different settings. And it's looking at how these weave together. So one of the main veins running through was that the social context for madness are part of the mad experience, rather than being impartial or separate to it. So these interconnections are non-linear and spiraling. So following this, I planned a collection of symbols in the form of cards that aims to demonstrate this, to kind of map madness and its entanglement with social context. So they follow the thesis by tracking the basis of consciousness, and then looking at shared experience, and then looking at divergent, non-ordinary experience, and how this interconnects with wider collective social contexts. Next slide, please. Thank you. Yeah, so I'll just go through this really quickly so we have time for questions. So yeah, I planned out 21 symbols. They started off by following the tarot structure and reimagining some of those traditional symbols, but then they veer away in very different directions. They're also cyclical, and they sort of follow a journey, but then the first card also follows the last card as this element of coming full circle. Because we have such little time, I'll just introduce these three, which relate to some of what we've been speaking about today. And just to note, it is a work in progress. The images themselves are very rough. So yeah. Okay, so yeah, there's a symbol of the net, which is the fear of madness. So fear pulls into it more fear. Seeing risk creates risk. The maybe psychotic is pulled from the periphery into the center of the net. And so this is a spider web, and the spider has the symbol of an eye on it, which is not so visible, but yeah, it represents a kind of gaze, a gaze of risk. Then we have the bog, murky edge world of mystery feared by many. Embrace it or hang back on the edges. The mad world. Here, time is distorted, visions are preserved in peace. Liminality is omnipresent. Everything touches everything. And then we have the crossroads, a pathology or a new kind of experience. Which route beckons? Some roads are wider and signposted, some are barely visible. Upon each tread, the path widens for those to come. So yeah, that's just some interpretations, but in being symbols, the interpretations are not final and they can be a relational process. So I'm really interested in yeah, what other people see in these symbols. So yeah, now we have a chance to go into breakout rooms if you would like to. There are some very open questions. So there's one that's specifically looking at the symbol of the net, or there's the question of just, do any of the symbols speak to you in any way? And there's also an alternative question, which is just, does anything we've spoken about resonate or intrigue you? So if you would like to, we can go into groups of 3 or 4. But if you would rather not go into a breakout room, you're also welcome to, you'll get a notification on your screen inviting you to join a group. You're also welcome to not join and reflect yourself for a few moments if you'd prefer to do that. And then we should have some time to come back together as a group as well. Is there anything you wanted to say about that, Katie?
Just thinking, should we stick to 5 minutes for that? Because I'm just noticing the time. We're so short, aren't we? So have a little bit of time.
Okay, 5 minutes, yeah.
There we go. I hope that everybody made it into a breakout room with another person. If you were in a breakout room, there's nothing lonelier than finding yourself in a breakout room on your own. So yeah, we've got about 10 minutes now for a few questions. So yeah, I'm sure there's a lot you could ask about the question, about the research findings, about peer group symbology. I mean, Sabina, your symbols at the end were so thought-provoking. Experiences of distress, and Katie talked about spirals, and that made me spiral off into lots of different thoughts. So all about the research process, how you went through the ethics. So I'm really interested, Sabina, about your Viva, like you talked about the mystical world and that kind of thing, and in a scientific setting, how you might have been challenged about that. So please do put your hand up or feel free to put questions in the chat if you have any for Sabina or Katie or any reflections.
Got Femi, with your hand up.
Emmy, come on in.
Morning. Yeah, just really interested in that, Sabina. That was a really interesting piece of work. I'm just fascinated by the use of imagery within it, and there's a. But I'm still trying to figure out that kind of rich metaphorical kind of focus which you've done. I'm thinking of Lakoff and Jung, and you've mentioned all of that, all of the good stuff like that. How do you translate that into anything, or do you bother to translate it into, the language of outputs in, what do you call it? Because it will be always so richly reiterative. Is it a sense of you kind of focus on the reflexivity of whatever you're feeling now? Because I can imagine looking back at your work, the person you will be in 3 or 4 months' time is going to come up with completely different metaphorical readings of what's happening. And it's that case of what do you call it, trying to capture the a current of a water at an instance. It's that aspect of that. Is that that do you, I'm sorry, uh, that ambiguity which is built into your research. How the hell did you translate that into a doctorate?
Um, Thank you. So to be clear, the kind of the symbols that I presented did not end up in the final thesis, because it sort of happened towards the end of the process. I created them more for my own way of processing the work, and
Okay.
actually I created them before the Viva for my own way of
Oh, I
like
see.
actually thinking about all the strands of my research. But then it became so interesting that I was like, oh, this is like a kind of follow-on project in itself
Oh, I
that
see.
I'd like to take forward. But so so basically what I presented with the research is sorry, with the symbols at the end there is like a way of interpreting the research that I did, but also as a way to like make it more interactive actually. um and yeah, but in terms of like how I made this into a doctorate, I don't know how to answer.
So it's a
um
bit of an unfair question, trying to
yeah,
what do you call it? Is a really complex thing, and in 3 words or less, just summarize it. It's unfair to that type of thing. So it was more
yeah,
of a case of provocation, how you would how you might answer it today.
yeah, I mean, so um the doctorate did I did have to limit what I was looking at a lot into um uh so I was using the method of phenomenology, which is a lot about looking at like um the kind of basis of like experience. And that was how I was looking at people's experiences, and then also the experience of moving through different settings, so the hospital setting, the peer support group setting. And then I kind of developed my own framework, which I called the world's framework, to kind of hold um, this idea of um, uh, altered state experiences, kind of touching on um, sort of another world, so to speak, that I used a lot of theory actually from people that look at like imagination as a kind of world, so that which is drawing on like Jungian um, theory. That was kind of how I developed it. Yeah.
Thanks, Somi. What an interesting question. Yeah, I won't reflect myself because I know Marianne, you've got your hand up and we haven't got much time, so come on in, Marianne.
Hi, this session has been amazing, by the way. It's all stuff that I absolutely love. I was just wondering what your doctorate was on, where you did it, and if you or anyone else know of institutions that will sponsor work, or supervise it, for the future.
um I could say about me, and then Katie could share as well. So I was at the University of Sheffield. I was in a philosophy department. Yeah, I guess I wouldn't say it was the best place to do work on madness. Like it was quite difficult. Yeah, doing lived experience research there. Um, but through the process, I formed connections with people in other places and kind of actually found a community of lived experience researchers, but that was more through going to events and things, and wasn't really in any specific department. But yeah, it might be different for Katie.
Yeah, so interesting, Marianne. Question. I was specifically studying with an organisation that was set up as sort of an adjunct to Liverpool John Moores University, because they found that mainstream academia was so restrictive in these kind of areas. So it's called the Aleph Trust, and they only do MScs and PhDs in consciousness, transpersonal psychology, and spirituality. So they purely study the transpersonal. So obviously it was brilliant to immerse myself in the field and find out all about the underground research that is going on. But interestingly enough, I couldn't bridge the mental health stuff, because what I discovered in the transpersonal field was that they very much still use pathological language. So that became my passion, is creating a bridge between transpersonal psychology and mainstream. So that was kind of where my passion came from. So I was just interested in the questions as well about our personal experiences. It's probably not enough time to touch on it a
You've
minute.
got 30 seconds, guys, to share your personal experiences. This is great learning for us because I think we probably could have had a longer webinar, or perhaps less breakout time and more question and answer. I just wanted to answer Marianne's question that the Survivor Research Network is a good place to contact if you're looking for routes into research. They have regular sort of meetings where they talk about survivor research, but also I don't think they're doing it for December, but they do offer mentorship to survivor researchers if you're looking for routes in, because it's not easy to find a route in. I don't think there's if you were a nurse there would be a route into research, but for survivor researchers it's not that straightforward. So I wish we had more time. There's some great questions in the chat. Thank you for sharing them. Katie shared the slides, and if you would like to get in touch with Sabina and Katie, there'll be an email that comes around after this with the recording and the slides. So please just do reply to that email and we can connect everybody up. Katie and Sabina, so sharing your research, really interesting on lots of different levels. And thank you everybody for taking the time out of your day to come and listen as well. Like I said, you'll receive the recording and the slides, and you will receive a link to an evaluation form, and we'd really appreciate it if you took the time to fill it out. Like I said, this is our first one of these, so any feedback, positive or negative, is really greatly received. And look out for our future webinars. This is the start of something in a new series. So yeah, that's it. Thanks everybody. Wow, look at that. 1 minute early.